Like and subscribe if you hate Karen and comment below where you're watching from. That's how I, Evan Carter, began my video that fateful morning. I never imagined I'd one day be broadcasting an utterly surreal story about how I accidentally made a Karen homeless. Yet here I am, ready to share the unbelievable events that unfolded right in my own backyard in the sleepy suburban town of Coral Bend. I'm a moderately successful software developer with a penchant for loud Hawaiian shirts and an unhealthy obsession with online chess. I'd moved to Coral Bend about 6 months ago in search of a quieter life after years in the bustling city. My modest 2-story house, complete with a slightly weathered charm, offered just the authenticity my wife, Olivia Carter, adored. For me, it was simply home, a sanctuary where I could unwind and, on Saturday mornings, indulge in one of my favorite rituals, washing my sleek, black car. That morning, the sun was beaming, the air was warm, and the sounds of a lively neighborhood filled the streets. I stood at the edge of my freshly mopped driveway, diligently working away with my trusty bucket, a bottle of fragrant soap, and a killer playlist of classic soul tunes. My private pool, a shimmering blue oasis, lay behind the house, an idyllic setting for a perfect Saturday. But then everything went off script. As I gazed across my yard, lost in the satisfaction of a job well done, I noticed an unexpected spectacle in my pool. There, floating with what could only be described as confused abandon, was Patricia Harrison, stripping down and splashing around in the water. Now, don't get me wrong, Patricia isn't just any woman. She is the infamous HO president in Coral Bend, a Karen whose days revolve around issuing passive-aggressive microaggressions and policing every detail, from the symmetry of her flower beds to the volume of reggae blasting from my car stereo. At first, I blinked in disbelief. Am I dreaming? I wondered, my mind reeling. My initial thought was that perhaps I'd confused my private pool for the community facility. But no, the community pool was over 3 blocks away, clearly marked by a giant, hand-painted sign. There I was, witnessing the unthinkable, Patricia Harrison, in nothing but her birthday suit, performing what could only be called a confused imitation of a swim stroke. Her antics were amplified by the fact that she was doing a backstroke, eyes shut tight, and humming an off-key rendition of a patriotic tune. I stood there dumbfounded, the image seared into my memory. My heart pounded, not from fear but from the absurdity of it all. Here I was, a software developer seeking solace in a quiet life, and fate had turned my backyard into the stage for a bizarre encounter that defied all normal expectations. Little did I know that this strange, naked intrusion was just the beginning of a chain of events that would soon escalate far beyond my control. The next few hours unfolded with an intensity that I could hardly have anticipated. After recovering from the shock of witnessing Patricia's unexpected plunge into my pool, I decided to approach the situation calmly. I knew that in Coral Bend, where every detail is scrutinized by self-appointed enforcers like Karen, any misstep, even a peaceful car wash, could trigger a storm. Determined to keep my composure, I approached my house with a curious blend of indignation and a resolve to understand what had just transpired. I strolled toward my pool, still dripping with the remnants of my cleaning efforts, when I could see Patricia still in the pool, now treading water with a haggard attempt at modesty. Her posture was defiant as she paddled slowly toward the edge, her eyes wide and accusatory even in their half-closed state. I called out in a gentle tone, "Patricia, what in the name of all that is holy are you doing in my pool? And why, naked?" My voice, a mixture of disbelief and soft humor, barely concealed my frustration. To my astonishment, she responded with a scream, loud enough to make the birds scatter, her voice rising in pitch until it sounded more like the shriek of an overzealous protester than a rational response. "Oh, Evan, you insolent fool," she shrieked, her tone mingling outrage with a bizarre hint of self-pity. "I'm freezing, and this pool is public property now. I'm taking what's mine." I was momentarily stunned. Public property? I knew the community pool was clearly marked 3 blocks away, and my pool was entirely within my premises. In that moment, the absurdity of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. Here I was, minding my own business, enjoying a well-deserved car wash, while Patricia, fueled by what I could only describe as a potent cocktail of Chardonnay and entitlement, had decided that my pool was hers to commandeer. I decided then that I wouldn't just stand idly by. My mind raced as I calculated my next moves. Yelling back or engaging in a heated argument wouldn't achieve anything. Patricia thrived on conflict. Instead, I opted for a calculated, mischievous response. "Patricia," I said with a disarming smile, "it does look chilly out here. Allow me to fetch you a towel and perhaps some proper clothes to keep you warm." My tone dripped with faux concern, even as I felt a thrill of anticipation coursing through me. Her reaction was instantaneous, a look of pitiful gratitude, mixed with the lingering defiance that never truly left her eyes. "Oh, Evan, you are such a lifesaver," she managed, shivering as she attempted to regain her composure. Behind the facade of gratitude, however, I could see that her mind was already racing, plotting her next move to reclaim her sense of order. Seizing the moment, I bolted to my garage where I kept a large cooler filled with ice, a relic from one of my legendary backyard barbecues. My heart pounded with a mischievous delight as I grabbed the cooler and raced back to the pool. "Hang tight, Patricia, I'm just going to even things out a bit," I announced, playing the part of a concerned neighbor while secretly relishing the opportunity for a subtle, cold retaliation. Standing by the pool, I casually unhooked my garden hose and nonchalantly explained, "I'm just topping up the water level." But as soon as my voice dripped with innocent helpfulness, I began methodically dumping buckets of ice straight into the pool. With every heaping cascade of frigid water, the calm blue of my pool was transformed into a swirling mix of icy shock. I watched, barely containing a laugh, as Patricia's face contorted with horror. Her eyes widened as the water temperature plummeted, and she instinctively tried to clamber out of the pool. "Evan, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice a mixture of genuine alarm and theatrical indignation. "I'm just making sure you're comfortable," I replied coolly, my tone imbued with an almost sinful sweetness. After all, no one wants to overheat. That moment marked a turning point, a playful yet pointed act of rebellion against the oppressive standards she sought to impose on my life. As the icy water sent shivers down her spine, I realized that this was only the beginning of a battle, one where subtle mischief might prove to be the best remedy against authoritarian control. The absurdity of my situation reached a fever pitch on the very same day. Not long after I had resolved to stand up for my rights, a commotion erupted that I could never have predicted. As I was tending to a few remaining chores in my backyard, still reeling from yesterday's events, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching. My heart skipped a beat as I glimpsed a sleek patrol car pulling up to my driveway. Moments later, an officer stepped out. I watched with a mix of incredulity and resignation as the new officer, Officer Benson, a fresh-faced recruit whose demeanor suggested he'd seen too much suburban absurdity already, approached, clipboard in hand. "Sir, may I have your attention?" he said politely, clearly unsure of how to begin. I braced myself, knowing the inevitable chain reaction was about to unfold. Behind Officer Benson, a second police vehicle slowly rolled into view, its lights flashing in a manner that felt disproportionate to the everyday nature of my routine. I soon learned from Officer Benson's halting inquiry that a 911 call had been made earlier that morning. The caller, it turned out, was none other than Patricia Harrison, the very same Karen who had invaded my private space the day before. According to the report, I was loitering near trash bins and engaging in suspicious behavior. I nearly choked on my disbelief. Suspicious behavior? The only suspicious element was that I was a black man happily washing my car in my own driveway. Officer Benson's expression shifted from courteous professionalism to one of uncomfortable uncertainty as he looked over at me, his eyes briefly widening when I casually presented my police badge. "Sir, could you please confirm your identity?" he asked. I obliged, replying, "I'm Officer Carter, Chief Carter, in fact." The irony was not lost on me. At that moment, Patricia Harrison emerged from her immaculate porch with an expression of triumph. Dressed impeccably in a designer sundress with her trademark platinum blonde hair and sunglasses, she pointed a perfectly manicured finger in my direction. "That man is blatantly violating HO regulations," she declared in a shrill tone that bordered on theatrical. "His lawn is unkempt and he's just standing there, flaunting his disregard for the community standards." Her words were accompanied by a flurry of gestures, a manic attempt to elevate her absurd claim. Officer Benson exchanged a knowing glance with his partner, Officer Ramirez, a veteran who had clearly witnessed his share of suburban disputes. The young officer then attempted to interject, "Ma'am, please explain what you mean by violating regulations." But before she could continue, the situation grew even more ludicrous. Patricia insisted that I was in such flagrante delicto that she had to call 911, claiming I was a threat to community safety because of my very presence, invoking comments about me being a black man whose behavior was suspicious. The officers, now clearly uncomfortable with the racial overtones, tried to defuse the situation. Officer Ramirez spoke up, "Ma'am, we have determined that there's no criminal activity here, this appears to be a misunderstanding." But Patricia's response was anything but reasonable. With a frantic look and a voice that trembled between outrage and self-pity, she continued to rant about public decency and the sanctity of our community, all while flailing her arms as if casting spells. I remained calm, even as I recorded every moment on my phone. The situation had escalated to a public spectacle that was as ridiculous as it was infuriating. The officers decided to give Patricia a formal warning for misusing emergency services, emphasizing that calling 911 over a routine car wash was unacceptable. Throughout the exchange, I kept my tone measured, insisting that I was simply a law-abiding homeowner doing my civic duty. After a few tense minutes, Officer Benson announced that they would file a report indicating that the 911 call was a false alarm. He then kindly informed me that I could continue with my day. Meanwhile, Patricia's face transformed dramatically as if a blush of humiliation had overcome her. Her anger melted into a mixture of shock and indignation. She sputtered, "This isn't over, Carter." A final declaration that, in her mind, the battle was far from lost. As the police cruisers finally drove off, I couldn't help but feel a bitter taste of irony. Here I was, simply enjoying my routine, while an overzealous Karen had managed to enlist law enforcement on her side through dubious claims. The recording captured every absurd detail, a potent reminder that even in a quiet neighborhood, prejudice and petty tyranny could erupt into full-blown public spectacle. I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same in Coral Grove, and that the seeds of an even larger battle had been sown. Later that week, the reverberations of the police call spread throughout Coral Grove like wildfire. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones at local cafes and community centers, sharing their disbelief that a simple routine had escalated into a full-blown police intervention. I, Ethan Carter, knew I couldn't let such an injustice stand unchallenged, not just for my own sake, but for the entire community's. The following evening, I attended the scheduled town hall meeting at the Coral Grove Community Center. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had been equally exasperated by the antics of the intrusive HO president, Patricia Harrison. As I sat among the anxious crowd, I felt the weight of the day's controversy settle over us all. It wasn't just about a car wash or a misused 911 call, it was about an abuse of power and a gross misuse of public resources. When the board moderator finally called the session to order, I rose to speak. My voice, steady and resolute, broke the murmurs. "Good evening, everyone. I'm here to share facts and experiences that have affected our community recently." I began by recounting, in clear detail, the events of that morning. How I was peacefully washing my car, how an unfounded complaint was made by Patricia Harrison, and how the officer's visit turned the situation into a spectacle. I played the audio clip from the encounter, letting residents hear the officer's questioning and Patricia's absurd claims. I then showed still images captured on my phone, the moment her face contorted in fury when she heard my identification, the stark contrast between my calm demeanor and her hysterical outburst, and even the brief glimpse of the patrol car's flashing lights. With each piece of evidence, the room grew silent, listening intently as I pointed out how our basic rights as homeowners were being trampled upon. I referenced specific sections of the HOA bylaws that clearly stated that using one's own property for routine maintenance was entirely within our rights, and I emphasized that no resident should feel compelled to call law enforcement over a mere car wash. This isn't about public safety. It's about personal freedom, I stated. When someone uses their authority to make false claims and call 911 for trivial matters, it undermines the very principles our community is supposed to stand for. Throughout my presentation, several residents nodded in quiet agreement. One older woman even clutched her purse tightly as she whispered, "I've been living in fear of this sort of tyranny for years." The room was filled with murmurs of shared indignation and relief that someone finally had the courage to stand up to Patricia's overreach. At one point, a board member, Ms. Thompson, asked, "Ethan, what would you say to those who argue that strict standards keep our neighborhood safe?" I replied, "There is a difference between maintaining order and creating an environment of surveillance and fear. We deserve a community where individuality is respected without arbitrary interference." My words seemed to resonate. The atmosphere shifted, as if the collective tension of years of petty complaints was finally being released. By the meeting's conclusion, the mood had transformed from shock to determination. A vote was taken, and the majority of the residents called for an investigation into Patricia Harrison's conduct and a review of the HOA's policies. Whispers of reform filled the air. I left the meeting with a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't solely about defending my own privacy, it was about reclaiming our shared community space from someone who had abused her power for far too long. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel that a significant change was underway in Coral Grove. The collective voice of the community had been raised, and together we had sent a clear message: personal freedom and fairness would prevail over arbitrary rule. I knew the battle wasn't over yet, but tonight marked a powerful beginning. The fallout from the town hall meeting hit Coral Grove like a tidal wave. In the days that followed, I, Ethan Carter, noticed an immediate shift in how residents interacted with one another. The collective outcry had not only ignited a debate on personal freedoms but had also set legal wheels in motion. It wasn't long before the news of the meeting and the damning evidence I presented became the talk of the town. Local newspapers ran headlines such as "Suburban Rebellion," "Homeowner Stands Up to Tyranny," and "False 911 Calls, When a Car Wash Becomes a Crime." The media frenzy was both exhilarating and unnerving. I fielded calls from reporters wanting details, and my story quickly spread on social media. Comments ranged from outright support, praising my courage, to heated debates about the proper role of HOA enforcers. One popular online forum post even called for a complete overhaul of the HOA's power structure. For my part, I continued to document every development. I received an official letter from the HOA board acknowledging the need for an investigation into Patricia Harrison's misuse of authority. The letter promised a review of all complaints and a call for new guidelines that respected homeowners' rights. At the same time, whispers emerged that local law enforcement might review the 911 call as part of a broader probe into misuse of police resources, a prospect that both angered and vindicated me. Meanwhile, several residents came forward with their own accounts of harassment by Patricia. Mr. Landry, a retired accountant, revealed that he had been fined multiple times for minor infractions, fines that he later learned were often arbitrarily imposed. Mrs. Delgado, a young mother, tearfully recounted how Patricia's constant scrutiny had made her feel unsafe in her own home. These personal testimonies painted a grim picture of a community living under the thumb of a single overzealous enforcer. Encouraged by this newfound solidarity, I reached out to a local legal aid organization specializing in homeowners' rights. I explained that I was not seeking revenge but rather aiming to restore fairness in Coral Grove. They commended my detailed documentation and assured me that my evidence was strong enough to spark meaningful change, both in policy and in practice. My digital dossier, which included audio recordings, photographs, and transcripts of my exchanges with police, served as a critical piece of evidence. At home that evening, I updated my blog with a thorough account of the past week's events, complete with my evidence and a call to action urging residents to attend the next HOA meeting. My post rapidly gained traction, and a wave of support further emboldened me. Community organizers began circulating petitions demanding reform, and local advocacy groups offered to assist in drafting new guidelines. The legal implications also started to mount for Patricia. Rumors surfaced that her neighbors had alerted not just the HOA board but possibly local district attorneys to her pattern of behavior. One particular rumor claimed that she might face fines or even criminal charges for misusing emergency services, a charge that would carry heavy penalties. Though nothing was confirmed yet, these whispers added fuel to the fire. Despite the public upheaval, I found myself wrestling with a mix of emotions. Part of me was ecstatic to see our community finally stand up to what I considered a blatant abuse of power. Another part of me felt a deep sadness over how one person's obsession with control could fracture the trust we had all painstakingly built over the years. Yet, I knew that if change were ever to come, it had to be sparked by someone willing to take a stand. In the midst of it all, my everyday life began to take on a new meaning. Washing my car in a clean driveway and tending to my modest lawn evolved from simple acts of maintenance into statements of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the arbitrary rules imposed by an overbearing authority. Every time I stepped outside, I was reminded of the struggle and the importance of protecting personal freedoms in our community. By the end of that tumultuous week, a new consensus was emerging. It was time to demand accountability from the HOA and from those who abused their power. I felt a renewed sense of hope that, through legal channels and community solidarity, Coral Grove could truly become a place where every homeowner's rights were respected. My fight, which had begun with a seemingly trivial incident, had grown into a battle for justice that would shape our community's future. In the wake of our public outcry, the energy in Coral Grove began to surge as neighbors banded together to challenge the overreaching authority of Patricia Harrison. I, Ethan Carter, noticed that what had started as an isolated confrontation was now a catalyst for a broader community mobilization. Conversations around town were no longer hushed whispers but frank debates. Residents were no longer afraid to speak out against what they saw as oppressive enforcement by an overzealous HO president. Every morning on my walk through Coral Grove, I observed small gatherings forming near mailboxes, where people discussed their shared grievances. One particularly memorable conversation took place at the local coffee shop. Mr. Hargrove, a retired schoolteacher with decades of experience living in the neighborhood, confided in me that he had received multiple fines from the HOA for minor discrepancies, ranging from a slightly crooked mailbox to a garden ornament that wasn't perfectly aligned. "For years, I've tolerated this tyranny," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But now, something's finally changed." Inspired by these accounts, I organized an impromptu meeting with a group of like-minded residents who had been affected by Patricia's arbitrary rules. We gathered in the back room of a small community center and spoke candidly about our frustrations. Mrs. Kim, who had once been too frightened to speak up at HOA meetings, shared her story of being publicly humiliated for using a non-approved flower pot. Others, like Mr. Daniels, echoed similar sentiments. It was apparent that Patricia's reign had left a trail of disenfranchised residents. Everyone from elderly retirees to young professionals had felt the sting of her micromanagement. Determined to build a case for reform, I spent the next several days meticulously compiling every documented incident into a comprehensive digital dossier. I sorted through emails, handwritten notes, and even photos that some residents had taken of awkward encounters with Patricia. My file, titled Fairness for Coral Grove, soon became a repository of the community's grievances, a testament to how one individual had abused her position of power. As the days passed, a grassroots movement began to form. On local online forums and social media groups, residents engaged in spirited discussions about the need for change. One post on a popular neighborhood app read, "It's time we reclaim our community from this petty tyranny." Another comment stated, "I've been afraid to even admire my own lawn for fear of a fine from Karen." These messages resonated deeply with me, reinforcing my belief that our fight was not just personal, it was for the collective dignity of every homeowner in Coral Grove. I also made several discreet visits to local government offices to learn about the legal framework governing HOA practices. I discovered that many of the regulations that had been enforced with such arbitrary severity were, in fact, open to challenge. There were legal precedents that protected individual rights against overzealous enforcers. Armed with this new knowledge, I updated my dossier with excerpts from municipal codes and legal opinions, making my case even stronger. One particularly encouraging day, I received a call from Ms. Alvarez, a longtime resident who had previously served on the HOA board. She expressed her support and offered to testify about the arbitrary fines she had incurred over the years. "We have power when we speak together," she told me warmly. Her words, along with the growing chorus of community voices, steeled my resolve. That evening, as I sat on my back porch revisiting my growing file of evidence, I felt a surge of determination. I was no longer just a victim of harassment, I was a leader in a movement for change. I drafted a proposal for a community petition, urging the formation of a new committee that would oversee HOA enforcement to ensure transparency and fairness. I planned to present it at the next town hall, confident that the collective energy of Coral Grove would force the issue. As the week drew to a close, the atmosphere across the neighborhood was electric. People no longer whispered about their grievances in private, they were discussing them openly at the local diner, at church gatherings, and even during the brief moments in traffic. Every conversation, every shared story, added momentum to our cause. Coral Grove was waking up from a long, oppressive slumber, and I, Ethan Carter, was at the forefront of this awakening. I closed my laptop that night with a deep sense of purpose, aware that our united stand might very well redefine our community's future. The seeds of change had been sown, and I couldn't help but hope that, together, we could reclaim our neighborhood from the overreach of a petty enforcer and restore the true meaning of community. The day of the emergency HOA meeting dawned crisp and clear, with a palpable tension filling the air over Coral Grove. I, Ethan Carter, arrived at the community center early, my binder, aptly titled "Fairness for Coral Grove," clutched tightly in my hand. The room was packed with residents, a diverse group of individuals who had long suffered under the thumb of Patricia Harrison, the infamous Karen who had imposed her draconian standards on everyone. The meeting began in the customary format, the board members took their seats at the dais, and a moderator initiated proceedings with the usual opening remarks about community upkeep and shared responsibilities. However, the mood quickly shifted when a voice from the audience requested to speak. That voice belonged to me. Clearing my throat confidently, I stepped up to the podium. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my tone steady and resolute. "I stand before you not just as a homeowner, but as someone who believes that our community deserves fairness and respect. Over the past few weeks, we've all witnessed examples of excessive enforcement that go far beyond maintaining order. Tonight, I bring to light the outrageous actions that have disrupted our lives." I proceeded to recount, with precise detail, the incident that had become the catalyst for change. I described the morning when I was enjoying my routine car wash in my driveway, an everyday act of self-care that should never have drawn police intervention. I explained how Patricia Harrison had arrived in her immaculate vehicle with her signature scowl and demanded that I alter my behavior by citing an obscure section of the HOA handbook. I played the audio clip of the officer's initial inquiry and displayed still images from my video. Images capturing the moment when her face contorted with exaggerated fury upon hearing my identification. As I laid out the evidence, I also recounted the broader pattern of harassment that had plagued Coral Grove. I shared testimonies from neighbors who had, in hushed voices, told me of arbitrary fines and needless intrusions in their lives. I cited copies of HOA correspondence that showed inconsistent enforcement of rules, highlighting how the standards were applied selectively to intimidate those who dared to live differently. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Several faces, once stoic and resigned, now shone with a newfound resolve. I turned to address the board directly. Our HOA was established to enhance community well-being, not to serve as a tool for personal vendettas. Our rights as homeowners are enshrined in the municipal codes, and we must ensure that these rules protect us, not control us. At that moment, Patricia Harrison, who had been sitting near the front with an imperious calm, rose abruptly. Her eyes flared, and she attempted to interject, this is all a misunderstanding. However, the evidence and the collective voice of our community left little room for denial. I continued, the facts are clear. When you misuse your position to impose your narrow views on every neighbor, you erode the trust that makes our community strong. The tension in the room grew so thick it was almost tangible. An elderly resident, Mrs. Collins, spoke up in a soft but firm voice, "I've endured your arbitrary fines and unfounded threats for years. It's time we put an end to this." Her words, heartfelt and resolute, resonated with many, and a heavy silence fell as the board members exchanged glances. The moderator then announced that a vote would be taken on a motion to remove Patricia from her position as head of the HOA. The result, when the ballots were tallied, was unanimous. A wave of relief and jubilation spread through the room as Patricia's authority crumbled before our eyes. Her face, once the epitome of controlled disdain, fell into a mask of disbelief and silent rage. After the meeting, neighbors clustered in small groups, discussing in excited whispers how this victory would mark the dawn of a fairer, more transparent Coral Grove. I was greeted with nods of gratitude and words of encouragement by long-suffering residents who finally felt heard. In that moment, I understood that our collective action was more than just a reaction to one absurd incident, it was a turning point for our entire community. Stepping out of the community center that evening, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. It was clear that the oppressive reign of an overzealous enforcer had ended, and in its place, Coral Grove would now nurture a culture of fairness and mutual respect. Though the battle had been long and the cost, at times, deeply personal, the future looked brighter. Our united voice had shattered the chains of petty tyranny, and as I walked down the street with renewed hope, I knew that this victory would be remembered for years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the HOA showdown, the atmosphere in Coral Grove began to change noticeably. With the removal of Patricia Harrison from her role, the residents' collective relief was evident. The new HOA board, determined to forge a fair and transparent community, swiftly moved to review and update outdated policies that had long enabled arbitrary enforcement. At subsequent meetings, discussions were filled with constructive proposals and a genuine desire for inclusivity. I, Ethan Carter, felt a deep sense of validation, not just for my personal ordeal but for every resident who had endured years of unnecessary scrutiny. The sting of past grievances began to fade as community members embraced a renewed spirit of unity. Neighbors who had once exchanged fearful glances now greeted one another with warm smiles, and public discussions became less about punishment and more about collaboration. On my own property, my daily routine resumed with a new sense of purpose. My familiar black car glistened under the afternoon sun, and my modest front yard, once a battleground of petty disputes, became a symbol of reclaiming personal freedom. I even placed a small sign by my driveway, a tongue-in-cheek reminder that personal property rights were sacred in Coral Grove. Local media picked up the story as well, with several outlets chronicling the transformation of our neighborhood from a place of rigid conformity to one that celebrated individual expression and accountability. Editorials praised the residents for their courage and called for similar reforms in other communities. In quiet moments at the local diner or in community forums online, many residents expressed gratitude for the newfound transparency and respect in our governance. For me, the experience was both empowering and reflective. I understood that while my actions had sparked a revolution in our neighborhood, it was the collective courage of the people that truly made the difference. The journey had not been without personal costs, there were moments of loneliness, frustration, and even self-doubt, but in standing up for what was right, I helped pave the way for a better future in Coral Grove. As the days turned into weeks, the painful memories of harassment and arbitrary fines began to recede. New practices were put in place to ensure that future disputes would be handled with fairness rather than punitive overreach. Community celebrations resumed, and the previously tense HOA meetings transformed into forums where every voice could be heard. That cool evening, as I sat on my back porch sipping iced tea and watching the neighborhood glow under the soft twilight, I felt a deep sense of reconciliation. The old order had been replaced by one rooted in respect, accountability, and genuine neighborliness. While the scars from the past remained, they served as a reminder that our community had the strength to evolve and heal. It was with this hopeful atmosphere that Coral Grove embarked on a new chapter, one where justice was not just a lofty ideal but a tangible reality. And so, with a quiet smile on my face and renewed faith in the power of collective action, I looked forward to a future defined by unity and fairness. In the months after the tumultuous events, life in Coral Grove slowly settled into a new equilibrium, a quieter, more considerate rhythm that belied the chaos of recent weeks. I, Ethan Carter, found that the experience had left an indelible mark not only on our community but on me personally. While the media celebrated our triumph over petty tyranny, I couldn't help but reflect on the deeper lessons learned from the ordeal. Every morning, as I walked past my driveway and admired my well-washed car, I was reminded of the absurdity of it all. A single act of routine maintenance had sparked a chain reaction that unveiled a community's hidden frustrations. I often thought back to that surreal moment when I first saw Patricia Harrison in my pool, and then again when the police arrived to investigate a supposed lawn violation. The memory was both humorous and haunting, an eternal reminder that even the smallest actions can become battlegrounds for personal rights. The incident had also made me more aware of the intricate dynamics that underpin suburban life. I realized that many of my neighbors had silently borne the brunt of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the stifling insistence on conformity imposed by a single overzealous enforcer. In our conversations at the local diner or during evening walks, people were now more willing to speak up about their own experiences of harassment. There was a shared understanding that our community deserved to be governed by fairness and transparency. For me, the ordeal became a catalyst for personal growth. I began to engage more actively in community affairs, attending HOA meetings not merely as a protester but as someone eager to contribute to positive change. I established a small online forum where residents could share their grievances, exchange ideas, and collectively propose reforms. This newfound sense of solidarity was empowering. It showed me that change is possible when a community unites against injustice. Yet, amid the positivity, there lingered a bittersweet reflection on the personal cost of standing up for one's rights. I occasionally encountered those who still whispered disparaging remarks, hinting that my actions were divisive rather than unifying. But the overwhelming support from the majority of our neighbors reassured me that our sacrifice was not in vain. In quiet moments, I also grappled with the complexities of human nature. Patricia's dramatic fall from grace had been a public spectacle, and while it brought relief to many, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sorrow for a person who had clearly suffered deeply. I wondered whether, in another life, she might have found peace without resorting to intimidation and cruelty. Yet, such reflections only reinforced my determination to ensure that no one would be forced to live under such arbitrary oppression again. As I sat on my porch one cool evening, watching the sunset and listening to neighbors chatting warmly on the street, I felt both humbled and hopeful. The scars of our recent struggles were real, but they were also the foundation for a stronger, more united community. My experiences had taught me that true strength lies in the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it means facing down a Karen with all the absurd power she wields. While the journey had been tumultuous, the lessons were profound. I now understood that every act of defiance, every documented grievance, contributed to a larger narrative of justice and renewal. And even as the memories of that chaotic time lingered, they ultimately became a source of inspiration, a constant reminder that change is possible when we refuse to be silenced by fear. In the final chapter of this turbulent saga, Coral Grove had begun to look markedly different from the days of oppressive oversight. The storm that had been unleashed by our collective stand against unreasonable HOA enforcement had finally subsided, leaving in its wake a community more aware, resilient, and united. I, Ethan Carter, now saw that the aftermath of our confrontation had sparked real change. The new HOA board, elected with a renewed commitment to fairness and transparency, had promptly scrapped outdated policies that once allowed individuals like Patricia Harrison to wield unchecked power. These reforms weren't just bureaucratic updates, they were a reaffirmation of our rights as homeowners to live freely and without unwarranted interference. In the weeks following the tumult, the once festering tensions in Coral Grove began to ease. Neighbors who had long been timid in the face of arbitrary fines and petty punishment started speaking out in favor of community progress. Informal gatherings in the local park and at neighborhood cafes became venues for lively discussion about how best to foster an environment of mutual respect and accountability. The oppressive atmosphere that had once cast a long shadow over our streets was gradually replaced by a sense of collective optimism. On a personal level, I felt an immense sense of relief and empowerment. My daily routine. Washing my car, tending to my modest lawn, and simply enjoying my home, had transformed from a source of potential conflict into a symbol of my steadfast refusal to be bullied. The red glow of my car, shining under the bright Florida sun, now represented not just ownership, but the triumph of individual rights over petty authoritarianism. I even installed a small plaque near my driveway that read, "Our property, our pride," a daily reminder of the victory we had achieved. Local media outlets picked up the story as well, with headlines heralding it as a watershed moment for suburban justice. Opinion pieces appeared, urging communities everywhere to re-examine their own power structures and to stand firm against oppressive regulation. Such coverage not only recognized our small victory but also sparked broader conversations about civic rights and accountability in neighborhoods across the region. Yet, as the community moved forward, I couldn't help but reflect on the complexities that remained. Although most of our residents celebrated the changes, there were lingering debates over whether the harsh measures taken against Patricia had been entirely just. I found myself weighing the delicate balance between accountability and compassion, between bringing someone to justice and understanding the personal demons that may drive them to act out. In my quiet moments on the porch, as I watched the sunset wash over Coral Grove, I felt hopeful. The battle had been long and, at times, bitter, but it had also united us in a common purpose. We had transformed our neighborhood from one overshadowed by arbitrary fear into a community that valued fairness, dialogue, and mutual respect. As I locked my door each evening and glanced back at the street, now filled with smiling faces and genuine interactions, I knew that our future was bright. We had learned that even the smallest actions could spark monumental change and that by standing together, we could build a better, more inclusive community. I, Ethan Carter, now sign off with a heartfelt message of hope: never underestimate the power of unity and the importance of defending your rights. Here's to a future where every homeowner in Coral Grove can live freely, unburdened by petty tyranny, and where we all continue to stand tall together.